This is one of the most famous stories in Wilmington's history. It's about a young lady named Nancy Adams Martin who, so the story goes, died on a round-the-world sea voyage with her father and brother on board. They had been planned to be gone about a year. Shortly after they departed Wilmington, she got ill and her condition continued to worsen. And she finally died in late May of 1857. Rather than bury her at sea, as befitting a good sailor, they decided to return to Wilmington with her body preserved in a cask of alcohol. Now, they were beyond the point of no return. They were on a business trip, but also a pleasure trip. So they were going to the West Indies and other ports of call to deliver cargo, but also to sightsee. And they were too far away from Wilmington to just turn around and come back with Nancy Martin on board. So they preserved her in a cask of alcohol, continued on the sea voyage, and then returned to Wilmington. But when they returned, rather than remove her from the cask, they simply buried her in Oakdale Cemetery as she had been placed when she passed away weeks before, maybe months before, according to Lewis T. Moore. The story itself was not told by Lewis T. Moore until 1926. So 1857 to 1926. And so that's the story as he told it. And this is an early photograph of her grave in Oakdale Cemetery. So the Martins were from Castine, Maine. They moved to Wilmington in 1847 when this photograph, the earliest photograph of Wilmington, was taken. And it shows the Burgwin-Wright House and St. James Episcopal Church in the rear. So when you walk out or when you walked in, you saw that same view. And so that's why I used not only the photograph on the back cover, but an engraving of that same view from an illustrated newspaper, which were very popular in the day. So I love that. So they moved to Wilmington in 1847. What attracted Silas H. Martin and his wife Margaret and Nancy Adams Martin was probably their son, Silas Nelson Martin, who was already living in Wilmington and went to work for Edward Kidder, and they had a firm called Kidder and Martin. And they dealt in real estate. They sold cargoes of lumber in naval stores, particularly in the West Indies. So they were mariners, had been back in Maine, and now Silas Martin's father shows up. We don't have a photograph of him, and he also goes into the maritime trade. Wilmingtonians thought so highly of him within just a few years that they appointed this Yankee from Maine to the Commissioner of Navigation. This was a very important board that handled maritime matters in Wilmington Harbor. He also went into basically the tugboat business, owning tugboats that would tow and push large ocean-going vessels up and down the Cape Fear River and around the harbor. But they were also a seafaring family. They traveled a lot. They would travel back to Maine to visit family. But as this passenger list shows that I discovered on a genealogical site, they went to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1851 and returned to Wilmington on board the bark Minnesota. So they traveled the 7 seas, all of them. The father, Silas H. Martin, Silas Nelson Martin, and John Salter Martin. So 1857, not unusual. Silas Martin took Margaret, his wife, and Nancy on a round-the-world trip, so the story goes. And while they were out at sea, she died, placed into that cask of alcohol, a natural preservative. until they could return her body home, because of course the mother would be distraught if they had buried her at sea or in the West Indies. Now, the story, according to Lewis T. Moore, claims that John Salter Martin also died at sea on that very same voyage. That a rogue wave or a squall or storm swept him overboard and he was lost at sea. So Silas returns to Wilmington without his son, John Silas, and with his daughter in that cask of rum to be buried. So you can imagine how distraught the mother was at the loss of both of her children, or two of her children. So the Martins chose a beautiful spot on the north rim of Oakdale Cemetery, overlooking Burnt Mill Creek. What we call Burnt Mill Creek is not the real Burnt Mill Creek. The creek that runs through Oakdale Cemetery is the real Burnt Mill Creek. The other one is Green's Mill Pond Channel, but that's another story for another day. But they chose a nice waterfront piece of property and they buried her. Now, look, the first burial in Oakdale had been in February of 1855. So she's buried, what's that, 16 months later. So there were not many burials, and they had a choice of prime property, and they chose this beautiful piece of property overlooking Burnt Mill Creek. And they erected this granite cross, carved, of course, cut short, symbolizing a life cut short, tilted limbs, and elegantly but simply embossed Nance, which was her nickname, apparently. Now, here's what I discovered. She died in late May of 1857, as Lewis T. Moore claimed, but not at sea. She died in Cardenas, Cuba, which was one of their ports of call. Kidder and Martin regularly traded in Cuba, in Trinidad, Jamaica, and here is a death notice that appeared in the Wilmington Tri-Weekly commercial in early June, that she died on May 25th of consumption, which was the term for tuberculosis in those days. Now, Oakdale Cemetery also has her death certificate. And as you can see, it also notes that she died in Cardenas, Cuba, and that she died of consumption. What's also interesting is at the very top, her grave is with brick and stone. In other words, they placed her into a ground vault. Now, why would they do that? I'm going to come back to that later on. So, she did not die at sea. She died in Cardenas, Cuba, of tuberculosis. Why Cardenas, Cuba? Again, it was a place that was a regular port of call for Kidder and Martin. It was established in 1828 by Cuban and Spanish aristocrats. It was considered the Charleston of the West Indies. So it was a popular vacation spot. But for our purposes, I think she had gone there not as a representative for her brother's business, but to try and improve her health. A warm climate, one of the prescriptions for dealing with tuberculosis, which, by the way, killed 25% of all Americans in the 1800s. It's a bacteria, of course. They didn't know that then, but the doctors prescribed sea voyages or salt air for dealing with such things. Some of you Wilmingtonians may remember Baby's Hospital down on Wrightsville Sound. Dr. James Sidbury, who built that, was the Michael Jordan of pediatric medicine in the United States. And why did he build it on Wrightsville Sound? Because salt air and salt water was the cure-all. And that's in the 20th century. So I think that she went to Cuba to try and improve her health, because the bacteria may have ravaged her body for months and even years. So the constant coughing, the blood, the hemorrhaging, I think finally had reached its fatal end, and she went there to try and improve her health. That's just my speculation. I don't know that for sure. So she was brought back to Wilmington, buried, but the obelisk marking the family grave in Oakdale also notes the loss of John Salter Martin at sea in September of 1857. Now, he did not die on the same voyage. He died the following September. And when he departed Wilmington with a cargo of lumber for Cardenas, left on September the 9th, what he did not know, nor could he have known, was that roaring up the Atlantic seaboard was a powerful hurricane. And sometime in the next, say, 48 hours, they collided. And the ship and all officers and passengers and crew were lost in that hurricane, never to be seen or heard from again. So that's what happened to John Salter Martin. There was some hope that the bark that he commanded, the L&H Hobart, might be found, but it never was. Now, I did find later in December of 1857, one sea captain returned to Wilmington. He said, we found the remains of a bark, and he gave the specific coordinates, which I include in the footnotes in the book, that he believed might have been the ship, but of course there were no survivors. Now, as it turns out, the father also died at sea. This is getting depressing, I know. When the war broke out, and for those of you from north of the Mason-Dixon line, when Southerners say the war, you know what war we're talking about, right? It's the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, both Silas H. Martin, the father, and Silas Nelson Martin, the son, the second son, went into the blockade running trade. It's a very lucrative business of trading cotton for guns in Europe, and these Confederate commerce vessels would smuggle supplies into Confederate seaports to help the Confederacy sustain its war effort. And it was a very lucrative trade if you did not get caught. Mm-hmm. Now, remember how Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind made his fortune? Mm-hmm. As a blockade runner, as they were called, right? And then he did get Scarlett O'Hara, and then he did give a damn, right? So the Martin men went into the blockade running trade. And in August of 1861, in a bark called the Albion, Silas H. Martin departed Wilmington and went to the West Indies. And on his way back in August, about a month later, the ship was intercepted by the USS Seminole. It's the only image that we have of the USS Seminole, a blockading vessel off Charleston, South Carolina. The commanding officer of the Seminole sent a boarding party to check out this ship that he suspected was a blockade runner. Martin claimed that no, the vessel was owned by a Canadian. He had documents to prove it. I'm on my way to Canada, but the commanding officer of the Seminole was having none of it. He said, no, you're a blockade runner. And so they seized the vessel. It was towed to Hampton Roads, Virginia, which was the squadron, the Atlantic Blockading Squadron's headquarters. And there the crew was taken and put into military prisons. And as it turns out, 3 weeks later, Silas H. Martin died on board the Seminole. So his officers and crew of North Carolinians were sent to prison. He's still on board the Seminole. Why? Had he galvanized? In other words, had he taken the oath of allegiance and joined the United States Navy? Why would he do that? He's 66 years old. Why would he do that? If he did that, but as some evidence of that, he died of apoplexy, or what we would call a stroke, or some cardio event. But he is buried in the Hampton National Cemetery. Now, as you know, because we have a national cemetery in Wilmington, there are 5 in our state, You have to be U.S. military personnel or the spouse thereof to be accorded the honor of burial in a national cemetery. So how did he end up in a national cemetery? And this is a terrible picture, the only one I could find. Silas H. Martin, USN, U.S. Navy. But there is absolutely no record whatsoever of a Silas H. Martin or an S.H. Martin in the United States Navy during the Civil War. So, as in all historical inquiry, it raises more questions than it does give you answers. So, well, Silas Martin did not die at sea. He was a very prominent member of Wilmington's community. He, after the war, established himself as a good unionist. He served on the Freedmen Savings Bank Board of Directors. He was the local agent for U.S. grants run for the presidency in 1868 and was our mayor for 2 years in the early 1870s. So he was a very, very prominent member of the community, as were the Martin family for the remainder of their lives. And they're all buried here together. And here's a wider view of Lewis T. Moore's photograph of Nancy Martin's grave from about 1930. You can see it here. And there it is again. Now I'll tell you, since I put together this PowerPoint show, I have spoken with Eric Cozen, the superintendent of Oakdale Cemetery. And he said, Chris, we just did a ground penetrating survey of her grave. Your book has sort of inspired me to see what's what. And they said, given the closeness of these other graves, we really couldn't get a good readout. But what I can tell you is she is not buried horizontally. There is a body there, and it is slumped. The head is down. They say, keep in mind, we didn't get a great reading, but from what we can see, the body is more or less vertical, and the head is down, which indicates to me that the story of her being buried in the cask is probably true. Okay. Any questions, comments, observations, hallucinations about that story? Yes, sir.
What type of alcohol was in the barrel?
Well, we don't know. Alcohol would have been a natural preservative, probably rum. Right, because Wilmingtonians traded for a lot of rum in Cuba, and Havana cigars too. They were always bringing back Cuban cigars, but probably rum. Elliot?
What was the name of the vessel that she died on? Any record of the name of the vessel?
We don't know. It was a bark, but I don't have a name for it.
On its way to Cardenas.
Well, Lewis T. Moore is the first to write about it, and he says it's a round the world sea voyage.
But she must have had her records say she died in Cardenas.
That's right.
Although she died on shipboard.
That's right. I have the name of the vessel. I suspect one that left on April the 9th from Wilmington, and it was the Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T. And it stands to reason that she would have gone to Cardenas on board a vessel in the flotilla of Kidder and Martin. It stands to reason that her body would have been returned to Wilmington on board one of their vessels. Now, was her father or brother with her in Cardenas? We have no record of that whatsoever. I don't think the father would have been, because in May of 1857, he was appointed the head of the board that oversaw all maritime matters in Wilmington Harbor. So I think he would have been too busy to have gone, but maybe Silas Nelson was the captain of the vessel. We don't know. But he also hired his brother, John Salter Martin, to be captain or commander of various vessels in the fleet.
Curiouser and curiouser.
It gets curiouser and curiouser, doesn't it?
Was Lewis T. Moore the first one to spin this tale? Because he references, Sprunt and Howell and Waddell in his work. Did he borrow that from them, or was he the first one?
He was the first one. 1926 is the earliest time that I can find this story. And it appeared not in a Wilmington newspaper, but in a Winston-Salem newspaper. Now, it was reprinted verbatim in local newspapers in 1948. But he's using all of these stories to promote and to boost heritage tourism in Wilmington, which I get. In his day, he was the largest booster of Wilmington. And there's a historical marker to him in front of the Lower Cape Fear Historical Society at 3rd and Orange Streets.
I recall hearing a story in the late 40s, early 50s when I was a student at the William Hoover School, elementary school. The first I heard of it, and I was probably 9 years old, 10 years old.
You know, Elliot, I hate to tell you this, but I'm getting ready to turn 70. I figured out I am now 1/4 the age of Wilmington. Where did that come from? Are you kidding me? I mean, that's the oldest story. We are now part of the history of Wilmington. We're not, past history. We're living history. But yeah, we're becoming the history.
We're the Grios.
Gosh.
Were there any ship logs that could, determine or give more evidence?
No ship logs that are extant. I mean, I turned over every stone that I could find. And this is the best that I could come. Now, this is my interpretation of the tale based on the evidence that I uncovered. A future historian may have access to records that have yet to come to light, yet to surface, that may change the outcome of the story.
Ship logs that you discovered but didn't fit this scenario at all?
No. But, the records of Wilmington have burned several times. Wilmington has burned a lot of times, and we've lost a lot of our history. For example, in the early 1980s, the Corps of Engineers destroyed 80 cubic feet of Wilmington Civil War records. And that's in the 1980s. So for 125 years, those records survived, and then they burned them.
What circumstances?
I can't answer that. An employee of the Corps of Engineers told me it was because of storage space, and that he
Purposely burned them?
purposely. So, and that's 80 cubic feet of Wilmington history that were destroyed, absolutely destroyed. So,
What is the significance of that angled crossbar?
just a life cut short, short-lived. The limb is skewed. The tree is cut short. It's just symbolizing that it was an untimely death. She was only 24 years old. 24 years, 21 days.
Is that a traditional symbol of that? I've never seen that.
No, but if you go through Oakdale Cemetery, and y'all should go on some of our tours, I tend to do the history of the people who were buried in Oakdale Cemetery. There are 30,000 people buried in Oakdale, and every one of them has a story to tell. But some tours, Janet Siepker used to do this, and Chris, you know this, she would do funerary art and symbolism, right? So that if you saw a lamb atop a grave marker, that indicated that there was a child, and usually an infant. The first burial in Oakdale in 1855 was Annie Derzett. The Derzett house is just a block away from here. And her father was the president of Oakdale Cemetery's board of directors. And he buried his own daughter in February of 1855. And there's a lamb atop her stone grave marker. So you could do an entire tour just on funerary art and symbolism. Yes, sir.
Referring to the specific characters of Kidder and Martin, in this story he also mentioned James Sidbury. Are the local roads named after these particular specific people?
Yes. Now, I don't know about Martin.
Okay.
I don't know which Martin it's named for. My guess would be Silas Nelson Martin. Those records have got to exist somewhere because he was mayor of Wilmington. Dawson Street was named for John Dawson, who was mayor of Wilmington during the Civil War. So I mean, we could go on and on. Yeah.
Have any of their descendants come forth to corroborate this story?
A descendant in Missouri was a big help, and I helped her too. I had some material that she didn't have, and she had some material that I didn't have. But this was as close as I could come to what I think really happened.